paper. Okay, go. Order. Welcome to this meeting of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. Today we continue our inquiry into British film and high-end television with a closer look at the screening and marketing of films in our cinemas. And for our first panel, I'd like to welcome Mark Cosgrove, who's the head of cinema at the Watershed in Bristol, and Catharine, who's the director of the Independent Cinema Office. Thank you so much for coming. You're both really welcome. Before I start, does anyone have any interests that they need to declare? No, in which case I'm going to start the questioning. Mark, what role do you think independent cinemas play in the whole value chain for British films?
Yeah, I think the independent cinemas are in the R&D part of the industry. I think there's the popular conception of the industry is that production is where ideas are developed and kind of moved forward into making films. Distribution is where they move across and come to audiences, and exhibition is where the money is made. That goes back into production that producers kind of recoup, or distributors, hopefully. But I would say that, and so the exhibition's at the end of the value chain, but I would say that exhibition, and particularly independent exhibition and the kind of cinema that I'm involved in, is at the beginning of the value chain, and it's actually where that's where you can meet talent, because talent, as we know, just doesn't come fully formed. We don't know who's in our audience, and it's at that point that you begin to get engagement with ideas, inspiration. Filmmakers and audiences are seeing a kind of range of work that inspires. And there's a number of stories that I can tell about filmmakers that have come through. And exhibition has been a kind of key part. But independent exhibitors, I say, like Watershed and other kinds of cinemas like us that are part of the BFI's Film Audience Network, that we provide pathways through for people into different parts of, if they're interested in filmmaking, if they want to engage in ideas and discussions about what it is that they're watching on screen. Whereas if you go into a kind of multiplex, I think, if you said to people you're going to the cinema, they would on the whole think that you were going to a multiplex, and they think that you're going to see a mainstream Hollywood film. But there are many different kinds of cinemas, as there are different kinds of films, and where we sit is about showing those different kinds of films.
Catherine, do you think audiences actually care whether they see a film at an independent cinema or a big multiplex?
Definitely. So I think we've done quite a lot of research about that. Talking to audiences in the cinemas that we work with. And I think one of the things that you notice about independent cinemas is that they are much more they often function as a kind of community space for people who may not necessarily feel welcome or comfortable by themselves elsewhere. So they often have a really, sort of integrated relationship with the communities that they serve. They are often very interested in sourcing products within the venue. If they have a food and drink offer from local providers, they're often local people that work there. They often are, during COVID, some of them functioned as food banks. They can function as community meeting spaces for people who are, lots of them are operating as kind of warm spaces when there was very high energy prices. So I think it's not just about, they very much function as a kind of a space in the way that that a library might, or a museum might, or a gallery might, that it's not akin, as Mark said, it's a kind of very big ecosystem, and they function and operate in a different way. They're often the place as well where you might encounter stories that either represent someone like you on screen, which you might not see elsewhere in kind of mainstream cinema, or else introduce you to points of view or perspectives or horizons that you might also not encounter. So it's that thing that we know that is really magical about the cinema, that it's watching it with other people. It's a different experience to being at home and watching it, on your screen, on your phone. Something different happens in that space with those people, and it is also about what you're seeing and the stories and the perspectives you're seeing, and that also kind of transforms those spaces.
Catharine, first of all, I wondered how easy is it for independent cinemas to take risks in showing films, and sort of, if you were not to take risks, what would the consequences be if you just dished up the usual fare?
Well, it would be quite boring, obviously. I think the thing is, on the one hand, it's really difficult to take risks. You have to be really entrepreneurial. You have to be really innovative. You have to do lots with not very much money. You have to be creative. You have to be imaginative. You have to really engage in you have to be very audience focused, very much around who are the audiences that I'm serving, who are the communities I'm serving, who's this film for, which is kind of not necessarily a question. If a film's had 10 million spent on marketing on it and it's on a bus everywhere, then actually those questions are not the first things that are going to come into your mind. Whereas if you've got a small film, it's something that you saw at a festival, it's something small, but it might really speak to the people in your environment. You really have to think about what you're going to do. So it's really, really important, but at the same time it is always really challenging because your profit margins are so much smaller, and you're often, the way that the industry works is no one can ever tell you, no one ever really knows whether something will really work or not. We have kind of good ideas, we can look at the data, we can look at the history, but there are always things that surprise you, and then there are always things that disappoint you. And if you do this work, if you're a programmer or a curator, we have all had that experience, and in a way we teach courses or run courses for people or do lots of continued professional development and stuff for new entrants, and I often say to people, you haven't really started to learn anything until you put on a screening and no one turns up. It's like you've got to have that experience to start coming because it's a dialogue, and it's about sharing something that you think is, so I think it's really, really important, but it's really hard. It's a real challenge, but that's why it's interesting, obviously, and dynamic.
And foreign language stuff, does that still... I remember going to the Three Colours, someone did the whole trilogy at the Riverside Studios. Would anyone do that now, or would that...
Yes, absolutely. That's the sort of space that we sit in, and not only are audiences interested in new films, they're interested in the history of cinema as well. So seeing older films, and in fact repertory cinema has been something that's been growing over the past, I would say, 10 years. Which I think is largely, one of the reasons for that is that younger audiences are more aware of the kind of breadth of film culture through, platforms like Letterboxd, IMDb, so there's much, much more awareness of the history of film. And so when you screen older films, and, I remember when The Three Colours was first released, but the audiences will come and see them in the cinema. And I think, speaking to your last point about... risk-taking. I think audiences really appreciate risk-taking. That what you can get in the mainstream is, the kind of franchise model, because, what you're trying to do is build on the success of previous kinds of cinema. So we may well get Barbie 2, but, thinking about Oppenheimer 2 is a different proposition, because there was a kind of individual story. And what I feel is that, and what I experience is that audiences want to engage in ideas and want to engage in the ideas that film can generate. And independent cinemas are great places for catering for that discussion.
And what would help you do show more current British films? If it's going to all go heritage, it's a bit dangerous, isn't it? If it's all the old stuff, what would help? Do you have to do more events like you did with the 12 Years a Slave? And Steve McQueen grew up in my constituency. His mum, I know. It's abroad now.
Well, that's a great example, and it's a great example of an illustration of where independent cinemas kind of support and the interdependencies in the industry between the independent, and the commercial mainstream. Is that Steve McQueen, when he made his after he'd done his art career, when he made his first film, Hunger, it was shown in independent cinemas first. And he's demonstrated himself as a filmmaker. When he released 12 Years a Slave, it opened in commercial cinemas as well as independent cinemas. When we screened that film, and this is a kind of another illustration of this kind of strength of what independent cinemas that are kind of place-based and thinking about and relating to their local communities, is, I might not sound it, but I've been in Bristol for 30 years. And when we screened 12 Years a Slave, as I say, it opened commercially, i.e. it opened on a kind of wide release of, I don't know, maybe 300 prints. So it was on in the commercial, in the multiplex, as well as on at Watershed. But, I thought with showing a film that is about slavery in a city with a very problematic and unresolved relationship with the slave trade, that we should look at doing events and talks with it. And we worked with a black curating group called Come the Rev, and decided to put on a series of informal and formal events, because I do think that if people just want to go and watch a film, they should just go and watch a film. But equally, here was a film that was dealing with a very important subject matter, and we had opportunities for people to engage with that. And we had a young black woman at one of the events, and she said she said thanks very much for doing this. I'd been to see the film at the multiplex. And if you think about that young black woman's journey through the multiplex, and then being transported into Steve McQueen's fantastic, powerful representation of plantations and the slave trade, and she came out of that screening and she simply wanted to have a conversation about it. But that commercial model is not geared up for that conversation. It's geared up to maximise income, and it does a brilliant job, and multiplexes have done a brilliant job in raising the profile and income for cinema. But for that conversation, it's not geared up for it. Whereas that's the kind of intervention and the kind of place that we can have that conversation. So it's opening up, not just the money aspect, but it's the meaning aspect of the film. And because we're close to the local communities, that we can build relationships across those communities to have those conversations.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rupert. Jane.
Thank you. Last year, 16 of the 20 top grossing films were prequels, sequels, live action or franchise films. Do you think that is just following demand, or do you think there's not enough alternative being offered? Catharine, I'll come to you first.
There's lots of alternatives being offered, but obviously they don't have the same marketing and P&A budgets attached, and so they don't have the same kind of resonance. I think, to follow on from what Mark said, actually, that all, obviously the biggest story last year in cinema was the kind of Barbie Oppenheimer weekend, both those films. But obviously both of those directors started with films that were only shown in the independent, with Christopher Nolan with Following, and Greta Gerwig with Frances Ha before that, her first feature. And those, they don't, I suppose it's this idea that the independent sector provides a seedbed. So it's an industry that needs both of those ends of the scale. And if you looked at the films that took the most money and said, we need more of those, that's where they all come from, in a way. That's where all of those people, so most of the talent, start in that kind of seedbed, in that kind of, because that industry at that level is not going to take a risk. If you want to make kind of, 30 million, you're probably not going to give it that project or back somebody who's making their first feature. So it's important that people travel from the beginning of their careers, and that's where they end up, if you see what I mean. So it's not about, I suppose it's not an either or. It's like you can't have one without the other. And it's I suppose our world, our kind of things that we work with, tend not to be in that top 20. I think we work with lots of cinemas that are in places that are rural, or there's no other provision, or they're part-time, and we might show those films because it's really important that people have it's about democracy, and that everybody has the right to see the best of any kind of art form, and it shouldn't just be about people who live in kind of big cities. So we do play those films, we do show those films, we do work with those distributors, but I suppose the large part of our work is with the films that are not in that. But I don't think the fact that they are the ones that make the most money mean that actually you need more of them and not of anything else. It is just a very tough, but I think there's a kind of synergy between those two things.
And I was going to say that, I mean, I really do feel that audiences, you know, they do want to engage in ideas and the discussions coming from the films. And what I mean by that is I think they want films that engage with, they also want films that engage with, you know, the world and what it means to be living in 2024, and the kind of various issues that resonate with society and culture. But, you know, as Catharine says, it's the interconnectedness between that commercial mainstream and making those smaller films work better. And my illustration for that is Bait. I was hoping that Kate Byers, the producer of the BAFTA award-winning producer of Bait, was going to be here, because, you know, what happened with that film, which was a very small production, and as Catharine says about, you know, the marketing spend that goes on the franchises and the commercial mainstream is huge. I mean, you'll see, you know, the adverts on the side of buses, etc., and it really gets the message across. But for a film like Bait, I mean, their marketing budget couldn't even cover the side of one bus, never mind, you know, all the rest of them. But you know, here was a film made in Cornwall, made in the southwest, two producers from Bristol that had set up their company, Early Day Films, telling a very distinctive Cornish story. And we worked through the BFI's Film Audience Network, which is a great network of, you know, going across the country, of place-based independent cinemas, and, you know, kind of membership cinemas. And we in the southwest supported the BFI in the sort of grassroots campaign of that film, and was delighted. I mean, I'm very surprised, because as we all know, you never quite know where the successes are going to come from. But I know that the BFI's thinking of what it would take at the box office was £50,000. You know, terribly small, but an important film. It went on to take 500,000. You know, so that was a 10 times you know, box office income and impact that film made. And that's through that kind of the cinemas that, you know, Catharine and I guess represent, is that they're much closer to the communities, and so allow distributors, rather than the kind of, you know, distributors are largely all London based, and, you know, use very blunt tool of big marketing campaign. But, you know, working in that much more nuanced and grassroots way, you're actually targeting the communities, and it gets it can get more impact. Now, that impact might not register in economic terms, but it registers locally, culturally. But also Mark Jenkins and indeed Kate and Lynn have gone on to, you know, other productions, and the reason that Kate couldn't be here is that she's filming in Glasgow at the moment.
Thank you. Advertising keeps coming back in what you're saying. Have you turned to more sort of viral marketing? You know, Barbenheimer on Twitter was going crazy last summer. Do you think that's where independent films can have a little bit more traction? We heard evidence from James Hawes about his feature One Life that ended up taking 10 million at the box office. Do you think there could have been ways to make that take even more? Or where's the sort of space for not big money advertising but effective marketing to smaller kind of groups?
Well, I think the independent cinemas working with the distributors closer on being kind of smarter in a way with, you know, the marketing spend. With I remember with I, Daniel Blake, that we the distributor invested in regional ambassadors, as it were, that were going to be marketing that to you know, trade union organisations, different organisations that were going to resonate with the film. And so it's thinking through the qualities of the film. And I think there is a really important, productive dialogue between distribution and exhibition about taking looking at the film and thinking through what the more nuanced campaign can be. And we've just done COPA 71 about the women's football, and we targeted all the women football groups around Bristol. Things like if you come as a full team, you get two for the price of one or something. But it's thinking through kind of ways in which you can get the subject matter of the film and relate it more to the kind of communities that it can connect with, over and above the kind of campaign that's going to go on the side of a bus.
Thank you. And Catherine, you mentioned food banks springing up in independent cinemas and all sorts of community things. Is that the route through to growing grassroots support for these films?
That's very important. I think it's really interesting to your question about is the sort of digital space somewhere that you can harness. I think yes, but it takes resources and it takes skills. So in terms of the kind of investment in skills in exhibition is like ridiculously low. And so there isn't a lot. In order for people to be innovative and creative and to be able to use those means, you still need some resource. And I think quite a lot of people in independent cinemas are really kind of having really, as everyone has been really kind of strapped and underinvested over the last few years. So many of them used to have staff. They used to have education officers or marketing officers or audience development officers. And those are the sorts of people who would develop their skills, who might work on some of these campaigns. I think you're seeing fewer of those staff in venues, and it becomes harder. So I think, yes, it is about being, the kind of Bates story, as with, lots of other, another kind of good example is the Eric Ravilius documentary that did really well last year, that really connected with local communities with a, tiny budget. Because, of course, it's about the story. It's about, it really has an impact on people who want to see more stories about their own history or about the history of their country, or it touches them. So you can kind of have lots of examples of these examples, and they do often use word of mouth, community engagement, events, like using digital space in a really creative and innovative way. But it all takes a lot of hard work, a lot of resources, and it takes skills. So it's hard. You can't manifest them off the bat. It's about, sharing all of that and being able to develop your own skills and,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, and good morning. Thanks for joining us. I love cinema and I love independent cinemas. And with so many independent cinemas closing, one of the concerns surely has to be that if they close, where will the smaller art house films and the films that aren't pitched to mass audiences, where will they go to be screened, Mr. Forge?
Well, that's a very good question. So we would share your concern about the closing of independent cinemas. It's a very fragile economy. One of the difficulties is that, some of the cinemas that we've lost may have been there for 30, 40 years. And once they shut, they don't often come back. It's quite hard to bring them back. Where do they go? They don't go anywhere. They disappear. Sometimes there's less places to show them. Sometimes they might play in the kind of the big network of community cinemas. So that's kind of film club, what you might know as film societies, or where people might start to show films in their community in a kind of village hall, but definitely they'll disappear.
I mean, is there a problem, Mr. Cosgrove, that the public are a bit hypocritical about these things? Because we all say that we love little independent cinemas, but the problem is with a lot of them, sadly, folk don't go to them. I mean, I used to spend my holidays in St Andrews, and twice a week I would go to the cinema there. And I noticed that recently Tiger Woods and Justin Timberlake, bizarrely, published plans to close this beautiful cinema effectively, to close 2 out of the 3 screens and to make it into a sports bar. Now, there's been a huge public outpouring about this, and apparently they've retreated. But I suppose the point that the cinema manager made was it's great that everybody's supporting us when we're threatened with closure, but we've got a 10% occupancy rate, so if you want to save cinemas, you've got to go to them.
I mean, absolutely, and I think that message. I mean, I know a lot of independent cinemas, particularly when we heard that cinemas like the Filmhouse in Edinburgh were closing, did all and started campaigns, and I think that made people more aware
of what they had,
and what was at stake. I think Edinburgh feels it absolutely, and the great news is that it seems as though they might be coming back from the brink.
Presumably, you can keep an old cinema like the one I mentioned. You can keep it. You can serve wine. You can make the seats more comfy. You don't have to close it. You can preserve the best of the historical features while adapting it to make it more accessible. You don't have to make it a sports bar.
No, I completely agree, and I would hope that they might, Justin Bieber and Tiger Woods might think about viewing cinema in the way that their kins have been viewing football at Wrexham, for example, and getting behind taking small kind of independent football clubs, smaller cinemas, and supporting that grassroots. But anyway, we'll see what happens on that front. But the thing
I hope
is,
the planners knock them back.
I mean, it's great. It's great that the cinema has made the local community aware, and I think that's what has happened by the closure of cinemas, is that everybody's become aware of what might be lost. But I do think that this might not be the end of it. I think that this financial year could potentially see other cinemas closing because we're dealing with a really difficult economic environment.
Right. Well, the committee went recently to France and looked at what we could possibly learn from the French example. Something that keeps recurring that people ask about is the idea of a levy on cinema tickets to help independents. Is that something that we should pick up and run with? Do you think that would work, Mr. Forge?
Yes, I mean, I think we would support. I mean, there's been a number of different things across the board spoken of in terms of levies. I think it's really useful to look at the examples from other countries. I mean, I suppose what we would just advocate for is that some of it goes into exhibition, because quite often when levies are discussed in this country, it's about, generally about production. So I think it's kind of important to look across the, across the board. I think, there's some really interesting examples, not just kind of Europe, we're looking at what's happening in Australia and New Zealand in terms of levies as well, and thinking about how it might stimulate independent filmmaking, how it might support new work, new voices, how it might support risk and innovation. And I think broadly we're in support of it. Yeah, I wanted to add to your point about the cinema, your example in St Andrews. One of the kind of things around cinema, or if you like, independent cinema in the UK, is that there is no kind of public capital funds accessible for cinemas. So if you do want to redevelop, if you do have an amazing building, there are sort of very limited means for you to be able to get access to funding to change that in the way that doesn't necessarily exist in other art forms. So the lack of access to capital grants is an issue. So we have a venue that we worked with in Shropshire that's probably going to shut now. They've had a campaign for a year, and they are coming up against some costs that they just can't access any funds to cover. So I think that is a sort of underlying issue, and as something that is of a concern and has been for quite a long time.
Before I hand back to the chair, Mr. Cosgrove, I presume you'd endorse that. What about the levy?
I mean, I know that the Eddie levy, for various reasons, ended up not working. I'm not sure taking money out of exhibition is necessarily a wise thing to do, given how tight things are. I know that it's been mentioned in relation to streamers as well, and I mean, again, I'm not massively over that economics, but I do.
Where do you get the cash from?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the question to address is where it comes from.
We're writing a report, so it'd be great if you could tell us what your your solution is.
If that is definitely something to be looked at. I would say is that in terms of if there's money that can be repurposed back in to support the ecosystem, and particularly that the risk-taking part of it. And what I was going to say was that one of the things that we've been looking at and would ask for is tax relief on risk-taking in the way that galleries and theatres have, which if that could be looked at for cinema, and the kind of, as Catherine's mentioned, the kind of curated programme. So, the commercial titles, the franchises don't, they've got that spend on them. But, when you're taking the risk on, talent development, audience development, that kind of unknown area where the industry is kind of on the whole risk averse, I think there should be some tax relief in the way that,
Thank you, Chair.
We were, as a committee, we were pushing for the extension of tax relief for lower budget independent film, which obviously we received at the good news at the budget. Do you think there should be incentives on cinemas to show that kind of film? I mean, could that be a part of the financial incentives? Because some independent films, some independent cinemas focus quite a lot on foreign language films rather than actually promoting British films. So we need to sort of make sure that we're boosting all parts of the British sort of film industry, if you like. So, how would you feel about incentives that promoted the British exhibition?
I think any incentive to support showing a kind of broader range of films. I'm not aware of cinemas that are showing European or world cinema at the exclusion of British films. I think they'll all want to show the kinds of films that they'll feel that their audience will engage with, and certainly British Independent is part of that. I know that Grinda Chadha, who I'd recommend the committee make the patron saint of independent cinema, said about a kind of Friday night in British cinema at the multiplex, and I think that's a kind of high risk strategy unless it's got a huge marketing campaign behind it. I think it's in the smaller areas that you can really make a difference, which is the kind of developmental side. Which I say is risk-taking with this exhibition and distribution. And if there is some way in which that can be kind of financially offset, then it would benefit the exhibitors.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Catharine, if I can start with you, if that's okay. The evidence you provided us with said the market is saturated with content, but we've also heard there isn't a consistent slate of films that people consider appealing. So what's the issue here? Are there too many films being released, not enough films being released, or is it perhaps something else?
Well, it's a sort of complicated complex area. I think it's a complex answer in a way. So the market is, I mean, maybe about 20 years ago, about 8 films were released every week, and now there are about 24, and they're all competing for, they're all competing for space in a cinema. They're all competing for an audience, audience's attention. I don't necessarily agree that. I think if you're a distributor, it will probably definitely feel like there are too many films. I think if you're an exhibitor, if in some ways the number of films being released makes it more interesting, means that there's more to write about, means that the public engage more with cinema, means that there's different kinds of stories, and that the stories aren't always coming from those bigger films. So I wouldn't agree that there isn't enough quality of films around. It is very much about the economic model of the way that you release a film and how you get people's attention, and how you can make those films successful. So it just means, I suppose the saturation of the market means that if you run a cinema and you've got 3 screens or 4 screens, you can never possibly show all the films that are being released every week. But the reasons why there are so many in the market, I'm sure you've addressed that again with colleagues from distribution about why it's a lot of it is to do with that it being a marketplace, and that the way that you make your money from your investment in those films is sometimes further down the line, and in order to reap that investment you need them to have a kind of marketplace and publicity. But I wouldn't agree that there aren't things of enough quality, but I think being able to find those things and connect them with an audience it becomes difficult. Hence, if you don't have like a huge budget, you have to find other ways of doing that.
Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, because it's not just the films being released in cinemas, it's the films that are available to watch on streaming, on mobile, etc. And I remember when COVID hit, having the extreme existential crisis, in that, our cinema was closed. Well, cinemas were closed, as a lot of society was, but yet people were watching films. So we were empty, but everybody's watching films, and so I think people are saturated. And it's about how you capture their attention. And as I said, the commercial world has a route for that, and I think independent cinemas have a different route, which is about the kinds of things that they do on the ground to make themselves distinctive, and to develop and build audiences. And that is about the kind of resources on the ground. The way in which we, as I say, if somebody comes into Watershed, or indeed other independent cinemas like Watershed, and said, "Why is that film on in the cinema?" "Oh, well, I'll get you the guy that put it on," or the programming group that came together to put that, so that they can have the dialogue about why that film. Equally, if a filmmaker came in and said, "How did I get into this business?" Then "Oh, well, you can meet this person who's the talent exec for BFI Network that lives in our building as part of the Hub Southwest," and so it's about those different areas of distinction. But the time when cinema was at the top and everything waterfalled down from that theatrical release has completely changed. So it's, how do you stand out? How does your business, how does your cultural business stand out in that arena in order to attract audiences?
I must say that I used to be a regular visitor to if I'm honest with you, but it's a beautiful place, and I think you should be commended for the work you do to support the independent cinema sector, because it truly is a focal point for Bristol and the wider West of England region. But I do have another question, and that is about the effective distribution strategies for independent films. Do you think they are effective, and what is the impact on exhibitors?
I think it varies from film to film and distributor to distributor. I think, as we've said, and I'm sure you picked up, is that the commercial mainstream has a model that takes up a certain size in the sort of landscape, but then there's all these smaller independents, both in terms of distributors, in terms of films, in terms of distributors, in terms of venues. And it's the collaboration, and I've given examples of, as I say, Bait and Copper 71, where you're working closely with the distributor in order to, we know it's a small title, but in order to maximise the impact of that and how you can be smarter with limited resources on the ground. And I think I would say that the BFI's Film Audience Network has been a kind of important, it's in the title, networked, and it's a network across the country of exhibition and indeed talent development, which works together in order to, as I say, try and maximise the reach of these smaller titles.
Brilliant. I'm conscious of time. I'll hand back to the Chair.
Thank you very much, Clive.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome. You've talked, Mark. You've talked about the impact of streaming services. So, are we on a trajectory where they represent an existential threat to independent exhibitors?
I've got over my existential threat, and I've got more. I've certainly got more confident in independent exhibition, and I think partly through COVID and seeing audiences migrate in huge numbers to streaming. And in fact, we dabbled with streaming on our website. So using our website, people said, "Oh, it could be your fourth screen. We've got 3 cinemas, so this could be your fourth screen." And we dabbled with it, and working with small distributors to push audiences through our website to see their product. I described it economically as not even peanuts. It was like the salt at the bottom of the packet of peanuts in terms of income. But when we reopened, what I fundamentally realised was that it's about the collective experience, and it's about the cinema space, and it's about communities, and it's about audiences. And that really reminded me of what it is that's distinctive and different from streaming. And it's great that people have access to many more films and much more content or stuff. But it then makes you, right, okay, how are we going to make ourselves, make our proposition something that's attractive and that will engage audiences? And from our experience, and thankfully over the past financial year, we've seen audiences begin to increase in a direction which, because when COVID struck, we'd like a lot of, like the exhibition sector, we're on a real high, and it felt as though it was only going to grow, cinema. And we're beginning to, I think, get back to that place where audiences are kind of coming back more fully. But they recognise, and we recognise, that there's lots of opportunities to view work. What you need is a diverse ecosystem, and we're blessed with it in Bristol because we've got a microplex. We've got everything from a microplex to a multiplex. And what you realise is that the more diversity and variety you have, the more audiences want, which is great.
So, I mean, what do audiences? What are they looking for when they come to an independent cinema? I mean, for instance, if it's a big visual experience, they may want to go to the cinema. But if it's just not such a big experience, they may well just wait for it to stream it on at home. I mean, what is it they're looking for, and what is it you do to attract people into your cinemas when you're up against that sort of easy access to content?
I think it's about. I think it's about, call it a kind of curatorial voice. Call it being open with the audience. So it's it can appear like magic, and I mean that's what's great about cinema is a magic trick at the end of the day. And what you want when you're in the cinema is you don't want to know that there's a projectionist, the things are being projected or whatever. You want to engage with the film, but films get to cinemas through a whole mechanism of choice and how things are made, and that happens in the production process. All the way through, choices are made, and audiences. We are the audience, and audiences are interested in that, and audiences are interested in what things mean. And so and I've spent a lot of time. We've got a very good cafe bar, and I've spent a lot of time there. And you're talking to the audience, it's like they get engaged with the film, come out, like the story I told you about the young black girl who went to see 12 Years a Slave. That's a particular story, but equally, films lend themselves to... I describe the screening of a film as a springboard for a wider conversation about society and culture. And that's what people want to do. Now, they don't have to. I mean, people can watch the film and, get the hell out of there, do whatever they want. But just knowing that you can come out, engage, and what did you think of that film? And that's one of the things that happens when you come out. What did you think of it? You hear people when they're coming out the screenings talking away about what that film was about, what it meant, and of course we're getting a lot of subjects covered in independent cinema. So it's not the classic sort of happy ending, that's it, go home. What you've got is open endings. I'd like to talk about that. Well, here's a space that you can do it, which of course encourages sales in our cafe bar because people like a drink to then discuss it. So yeah, it's that sort of it's that kind of package, as it were, is what we offer, which a servicing streaming service doesn't offer.
Right. Catharine, what could a levy do for the independent sector?
Sorry?
What could a levy do for the independent sector? How could it be applied?
Well, I think it can make more money available, and I mean, I know that you've been to France and you can kind of see what that's done. I think there is sort of very limited. We're in the kind of economic climate that we're in, and although the levels of public funding are really welcome for the kind of cinemas that we work with and the kind of films, from production right through to exhibition, I think we could do so much more. And that's what a levy could do.
I mean, what could it do?
Well, I think things like skills, like training, we do lots of work with young people. We do lots of work with communities. We do. Most independent cinemas have a offer that is for people with Alzheimer's. It's for people, the learning disabled community. It's for people who are autistic. So it's all about kind of looking at where those communities are, putting on additional screenings, making sure that you are fully reflective of the communities that you serve, working with people at the very beginning of their careers. As we've talked about, the economy of the system, people at the very beginning of their careers don't tend to be given enormous budgets to make films, don't tend to be given enormous budgets to distribute those films or to sell those films. So we try and support those filmmakers, those people at the beginning of their careers, try and connect those films with audiences. All of that is not necessarily something that it's all helpful when you have an element of substance. It all helps, as Mark reference, the kind of R&D nature of the business. So that's what would help.
So you don't see it as something that would support the core funding of the independent sector, more the additional things that the independent sector can do?
I mean, there isn't any. I mean, all of the public funding at the moment that's available for cinemas is all project funding. So it's a lot of independent cinemas would like a model that was nearer a kind of NPO model that you'll be familiar with for the rest of the arts. There isn't an NPO model, that kind of a model for the independent cinema sector. There is only project funding. So it's that then to resource and deliver and service additional projects all the time is quite hard, because there is no core. There's no core coverage, and quite a lot of the work that you want to do, we talked a lot about, how you make a small film work, how do you do that development work with audiences, how do you be creative, how do you be innovative, how do you, and again, to do that, you need skills. We looked at some data, and I think in the last decade, 2.3% of money that's available for training has gone into exhibition. So it's a very small amount of money. So when everything becomes quite difficult from the top to the bottom, to try and do the best that you can, grow it, do the best work that you can and make a difference is more challenging. So that's what a levy could do. I think it could transform things, actually, and it would, in terms, I think somebody's been, there's been lots of talk about VAT on tickets and looking at VAT in terms of sort of levies. So that's not necessarily taking money out of independent cinemas. That's about maybe being more creative with some of those sort of exemptions.
Okay, Mark, did you have?
Yeah, I wanted to raise capital development in particular, because smaller cinemas, smaller operators don't have, especially as we've burnt through our reserves during COVID, they don't have a lot of money to reinvest in the fabric of the building. So things like really mundane but important things like carpets, seats, projectors. There isn't a fund that you can easily access to do that. And then when you also, we're doing a lot of work around greening the building and the environmental changes that we're in a converted Victorian warehouse, and it's a challenge to do that. And so having a capital fund that would support that, I think would be really useful.
Chair.
Thank you, Clive. Julie.
Thank you, Chair. And building on Clive's questions, has the perception that the skills needed in the exhibition sector are closer to retail and hospitality skills rather than the film production skills hindered your access to industry-wide initiatives? And is that an accurate view?
Sorry, would you mind just repeating the last part?
Sandy had to go and tell everyone.
We have this problem quite often out there. No, so it's building on what Clive said about the access to funding, and has the perception that the skills needed in the exhibition sector are closer to hospitality and retail rather than to film production, hindered your access to industry-wide initiatives, and is that an accurate view of the sector?
It's not an accurate view of our sector. I think it may be an accurate view for the commercial cinema sector. But I think in our sector, I would see the skills needed. If I think I referenced, places like theatres, concert halls, galleries, museums, I would see the skills that we need as being much more around audience development, business management, marketing, we do provide some of that training, but there's very small amounts of money available to do that. So we do some of that, or we have been doing that for the last 20 years, but it's kind of a small scale. But so no, I wouldn't really agree. I think it's a different model though. So that's why, and I think, I would say this, obviously speaking in a kind of exhibition panel, but I suppose one of the frustrations in the way the film industry works obviously is essentially production, distribution, exhibition. So production is always seen as the most glamorous, most fashionable, most amazing, like very swanky, lovely. That's the bit that people would really like to work with. Distribution is kind of not seen as kind of glamorous and exciting, and then exhibition is seen as the kind of, more kind of prosaic sort of like shop window, which may kind of be more akin to retail. And then at the very bottom is independent exhibition, which is kind of, seen as the sort of like shabby kind of, not as fashionable or whatever, not as lucrative as the rest of it. But you see, those of us who work in it think it's the most exciting bit, because that's the bit where you meet the audiences. That's the bit where you can actually kind of make a difference. That's the bit where you take the thing that's been produced. Because obviously someone's got to watch films, haven't they? If you make them and no one sees them and no one engages with them, then actually what difference does that make? And so the bit that we do is about you take, and there is nothing more exciting than taking something that you have seen somewhere that no one knows about, that you think could really change. And like all great art forms, the best films change people's lives, change the way they think about you. If you all imagine your favourite film and it's something you really wanted to share with somebody who hadn't seen it, and how you would talk about it and what you would say, and and like when you meet someone, or you meet someone that you love, or you meet someone for the first time, and one of the things you might want to do is get them to watch this film. That really, and that's what happens. And so for us, that's the most exciting bit. That's the bit that's really transformative. That's the bit that makes you get up and go to work in the morning. And I suppose I think the skills that are needed in that environment are much more around kind of, I suppose, communication and marketing, and being innovative, being creative, being entrepreneurial, understanding how to run a business, knowing about profit margins. There's quite a lot of different things in there. That it's I would say it's not a criticism of the kind of commercial model, but it is a different model, and so it requires a different skill set.
Would you agree with that, Mark?
Yes, and I would say that our front-facing, staff, our cafe bar staff and box office staff are probably the most film knowledgeable staff that we've got. And then going back to that conversation that audiences have, actually the conversation that they have with the cafe bar staff or box office staff is incredibly, about the films, incredibly knowledgeable. And in fact, as I've said, in terms of the audience, you never know who's in your audience. It could be the next Christopher Nolan, Gurinder Chadha, and equally our staff, that's the case. So we try and support staff in terms of their kind of professional development. They're often doing it as kind of a job going through into an area actually of the industry.
You're doing a good job at selling your cafe bar, I have to say.
Well, our head of trading will be very proud of me.
Very good.
And finally, thank you. Finally, what role can cinemas play in demonstrating audience demand for films being made by those who represent the diversity of the UK population?
Sorry, could you just repeat that?
Am I not speaking properly? I know I've got a cold, I apologise. What role can cinemas play in demonstrating audience demand for films made by the diversity of the UK population?
I think one of the key ways is working in partnership. There's there used to be the myth of the curator in the art world and in the film world as well, I guess, that there's this specialist, and they are indeed specialists, but it's somehow their world view that is informing the programme. But what I've realised over the years is actually our programme is delivered in partnership with a lot of individuals and community groups. And that is one of the key ways into diversity, both in terms of audiences and partners, but also in terms of what goes on screen. So we do things like Africa Eye Festival, Queer Vision, range of different festivals and screenings throughout the year. And I say these can be programmed in partnership with groups like Pride, Come the Rev, and through the work that we do with the film audience, the BFI's Film Audience Network, that's also part of the kind of practice that we work with smaller cinemas across the region as well. And I just think that's a kind of key way of getting diversity, both, as I say, on screen, but also audiences, because you're then targeting and working with community groups.
I think they can focus on content, so what they show, and think it's back to the kind of programming curating question, but also thinking about the audiences that you're serving, thinking about the communities that you serve, who are the audiences that you're serving, making sure that you have the right partnerships, and I think what they can do is start thinking about the kind of the workforce and who's working, who's welcome, whose work is seen. So I think actually the best independent cinemas are those which really, and at the forefront of their, if you like, their whole raison d'etre is about thinking about the communities they serve. So the minute you start thinking about the different communities within your networks, within your immediate area, you are already thinking about who's welcome here, what are we showing, who's it connecting with, who should be working with, and that kind of, that's really central to the work that you do. So I think they have an enormous role actually to play in that, because actually the focus is always kind of on the audience. Who's here? Who are we working with? And we need to make sure kind of we're welcome to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Can I thank both of our panellists today? Was there anything that you wish we'd asked you that you were burning to tell us that you didn't get a chance to share?
No, only that it's this committee and the work that you're doing is really, really welcome. And the fact that you invited evidence from such, and that everybody felt available to make that evidence and to be able to write to you, and that you are seeing so many different peoples from so many aspects of the industry is really welcome. So I'd like to thank you for that.
Thank you very much. We'll put that on our CVs. Thank you.
Sorry, it's okay, but can I just add that I've mentioned the BFI's Film Audience Network. I really do think it's it's shown itself to be a really brilliant example of reaching out in terms of across nations and regions, and it's a brilliant network for supporting independent voices and risk taking. So I would, just say that.
You've both done an excellent job at selling the cause today. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm really grateful. Can I now invite our next panel to come through? Thank you very much. No, you're fine. It was because there was a lot of noise in the corridor. Andy went out to sort everybody out. Yes, we'll do that. We'll come back to you. Yeah.
What have I got?
Huh?
14.
Then we start on the
Start on 10, and then I'll come to you for 11, and you'll scoop up 13 at the same time. John, you're coming in after 12, aren't you?
Yes.
And are you doing something else as well?
No. I think so.
Yeah, you're doing
I beg your pardon, 16.
But I'll come back to you for that later.
But you want to have
Are we doing it all together? You happy to do it all together?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Let's do it. Okay. So, good. All right.
You go for it.
Good. Well, for our second panel, we're joined by Clare Bence, who's the Managing Director of Picturehouse. We're joined by Alex Hamilton, who's the Chief Executive of Studiocanal UK, and Tim Richards, the Chief Executive of View, and very recently the Chair of the BFI. You're all very welcome joining us this morning. Thank you so much for coming in. I'm going to start, and it's a bit of a generic question for all of you, really, but I'm going to start with you, Tim, it's been 21 years since our committee, our predecessor committee, obviously we're all far too young to have taken part in it, but our predecessor committee looked at the British film industry 21 years ago. What do you think are the most significant changes that have happened in both exhibition and distribution over the last 21 years?
Well, I think we've seen exponential growth in the industry, both for British film and independent film and major film too, and I think you've seen a considered growth in screens in the UK, and it's certainly, if you look at the attendance levels, both in the UK and globally, they've increased very, very maturely right through until 2020 when the pandemic hit. It was really kind of early days. It was just kind of early days for digital. Digital was a game changer because with the introduction of digital projectors, it allowed certainly all operators to play more movies to more customers. And that penetration continued throughout that kind of entire period. It's also when I started my company. So I kind of spent 20 years kind of building my company here in the UK. And it also really started, my personal commitment to British and independent film, where I've served on every major board in the company, in the country, from Film London to BAFTA, executive positions, and all of them right through, as you mentioned, to chair of the BFI. So, which an independent and British film, which we'll get to shortly, are a big part of my heart, what I've been pursuing.
Thank you very much. Alex, anything to add? What have you seen over the last 21 years?
Other than to reflect upon the fact that I actually gave evidence to the last committee, which I don't know what that says about me. But like Tim says, I think you can say on a broader macro level there's been very significant progress in terms of admissions, in terms of the offer of content. The streamers, even the streamers that I think for many appeared to be an existential threat, at the end of the day, they have led to an explosion in content available to UK audiences. So from that perspective, certainly on the high level, in terms of the underlying health of the industry, in terms of people going to see movies at the cinema, that's all been very good. I think it's fair to say, and it's been perhaps exacerbated in recent years, but I think it's fair to say that it's possible that that success has actually gravitated away from British independent films over that period. And I'm sure many of us could have a debate as to various myriad reasons why that may have happened. But a lot of statistical analysis around box office, for instance, shows that it gets concentrated at the very higher end of the biggest films getting bigger. The middle perhaps falling away a little bit, and certainly the lower films, not a lot of films being released each week that actually really aren't seen by an audience almost anywhere. So I think that the advent of the streamers and the robust work done by exhibition and distribution, and indeed Hollywood, has led to a great proliferation of content, but I think it has perhaps shifted the playing field away from what I'd characterise as British cinema in terms of people going to see British cinema.
Thank you. And Claire, same question really, but in addition to anything extra that you've noticed over the last 21 years, how do you see, can you get your crystal ball out and tell me, how do you see the next 10 years going?
Ooh, goodness, that's a big question. I mean, I agree with what Tim and Alex have said. I think, though, that the dominance of a few films each year that are where people go to the cinema, and really more working on the American model and more American films coming in. But I think, in a way, the industry's in a bit of crisis at the moment because it doesn't really know where the future is. Since COVID, the streamers coming into the marketplace, and obviously now what is clearly being seen, that the franchise movies are costing more to make and the profits are less than they were. So I think for the studios, they're looking now at what they're making, and of course it's like turning a giant ship into looking at the success of two original films, the Barbenheimer moment, which, as Catharine said, you know, these are directors that we and the independents have played, but I think it's the studios looking at that maybe audiences want some original content. So I think we're in a bit of a crisis situation at the moment.
Do either of Alex or Tim care to make your predictions for the next 10 years? What are the challenges coming down the track?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a lot more bullish. I mean, we as an industry, certainly in the period leading up to the pandemic, we're breaking records everywhere, both in the UK and globally. 2019, $42.5 billion of box office worldwide. And if you look at the attendance, we were just slightly below the record-breaking year in 2018, but very close. And we got hit very, very hard, I think, as everyone is aware, during the pandemic. One doesn't plan in one's business plan for full closure, and it was devastating for all of us and all screens, which I think I'll get to later on. But we were getting a small, fragile recovery last year, and then, unfortunately, for the first time in 60 years, Hollywood decided to go on strike. And so most of last year, there was very little, if any, film production going on. And that hit us both short and medium term. So that recovery that we had was delayed. But this year, there are some amazing movies coming out of all genres, and both British and foreign and Hollywood, but there's just not enough of them. And in 2022, there was 35% fewer films released than pre-pandemic. Last year, 20% fewer films. This year is probably going to be close or even slightly worse than last year. Good news is that film production has been ramping up very, very significantly by everybody everywhere. I think we're going to see a large number of films return at the end of this year. This is a business that is worth saving. It wasn't broken, and it's not broken today. We revitalize high streets. We drive footfall to high streets. We drive footfall to shopping centers where retailers have been suffering. And we have been growing from strength to strength, and I think you're going to see that return.
Thank you. Alex, anything to add?
Just briefly again, just to share Tim's optimism on the global film industry in terms of it's the fact that it's shown its resilience post-COVID, when I think for a little while a lot of commentators were suggesting it was under existential threat. And then I probably share some of Clare's pessimism, I guess, around the British film industry's role within that, because I have a sense that we must remember that certain events like Barbenheimer were essentially orchestrated out of Los Angeles. They may have been made with lots of British talent. They may have been made in Britain in one of the cases. But all of the key decisions around that film in terms of its production, in terms of its distribution, were made in Los Angeles and were rolled out across the world that way. So I think it's really important that we, if we want to establish the notion of a British film industry over the next 10 years, that we consider how it can have a commercial impact, very particularly in its home market.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Alex, keeping with you, if I may, in 2003, the committee concluded the UK's focus in the industry was too heavily on production, less so on distribution. What improvement do you think you've seen in that time since?
For distribution, I would say that there hasn't been an improvement, in the sense that you can see that in the past, even in the past 12 months, two independent film companies that were very well established in the UK for many years, I worked for one of them for 11 years, actually closed their doors, Entertainment One and Pathé. So I think in that sense, from distribution, it's actually perhaps tougher than it was. I think obviously the recent increase in the production tax credit was broadly very much welcomed by the industry and all facets of the industry. I think the industry are absolutely trying to present a united front and trying to actually construct a united front. But It does address the issue perhaps more on the supply side in terms of increasing perhaps the potential of more British films being made because the financial incentives are there to do so. But it doesn't necessarily increase the demand in of itself for British films. And bluntly, probably the burden of creating demand falls upon distribution. Obviously, exhibition plays a role in that, and we work very closely with exhibition. But both the financial commitment on the release of any film falls largely with the distributor. So the creation of all of the materials and the creation of all the media and everything that aligns to that. And so that is a challenge. And I feel that there perhaps is a sense of it being, as it was in 2003, a little lopsided in the sense that there is perhaps help with supply, but actually we haven't necessarily discussed or embraced how we're going to create greater demand for British films.
Thank you, Alex. Tim, coming to you, as the former chair of the BFI, why do you think policy interventions are focused more on production than distribution and exhibition? What do you think also needs to happen to change that?
Well, I think we are the largest private cinema operator in Europe. And so I can bring a little bit of insight in terms of other markets as well. And I mean, right now it's really hard, but kind of using some definitions of what a British film really is through the BFI. It looks like it's somewhere between 3 and 5% of films last year were British films, classic British films. And if you look at how that compares with other markets that we're operating in Germany, that's 18.5%, Italy, 16%, Netherlands, 17%, Poland and Denmark, 20 to 25%. So considerably higher. And I think there's been, particularly in the post-pandemic period, there's been a lot more support to try and revitalize the industry during that period. I will say, a massive thanks to government, because I would not be sitting here today if it were not for your support during the pandemic. But I think where I've seen it change a little bit is in our other markets, that support continued. In Italy in particular, you can see how the government put hundreds of millions of euros into Italian film production. They also made availability for cinema operators to refurbish their cinemas or open new cinemas with, if a smaller operator, it would be a 60% tax credit, and if it was a large operator like ourselves, it would be a 30% tax credit. That's been huge. Last night, we brought in C'è ancora domani, the biggest film of all time, in one of the biggest films of all time in Italy, and we screened it in Leicester Square last night. And I think that, again, is kind of demonstrating what is possible. And you see that kind of evidence in a lot of other markets. France is a bit of an anomaly because they've always done massively more. I mean, somewhere between 40 and 50% of box office is French films, classic French films. So I think it's kind of a combination of a lot of variables, and I think the work that the BFI has done has been, absolutely fantastic in planting those seeds. We just need to kind of keep going.
I'm glad to hear optimism, because obviously we know that the last few years we've seen significant failings in the cinema industry, with cinemas closing and for all sorts of reasons, very old buildings in some cases, impossible to heat, electricity bills through the roof and all the challenges that come with it. But we've seen those economic weaknesses not left behind by the larger chains like yourselves. What's behind that? What are the solutions? I know obviously the pandemic was a huge impact. You can't close an industry down and expect it to bounce back instantaneously. But what is behind, do you think, some of the failings of some cinema chains?
If you could bear with me, I'd love to dispel a big myth.
Go on.
The big myth is that screens are all within one ecosystem. There is no such thing anymore as an independent cinema, an art house cinema, or a major cinema. We are all screens, and we all deliver films, and we all love movies personally as well. And if you look at what the actual facts are, and I never thought I'd be here supporting my competitors, but if you look at the three main, classic multiplex operators, Odeon, Cineworld, and ourselves, 81% of films last year were what classified as independent films were screened by us. That compares against Picturehouse, 10% less, 74%, and puts us kind of reasonably close to where somebody might think a art house cinema definition might be. But art house cinemas, in the classic sense, are showing the same movies that we are showing day in, day out. And I'm a massive fan of Watershed, and I think what Mark has done there is extraordinary, and I like going there as a customer as well. But I mean, I just looked for fun last week. Every major show for the next week is Civil War. And that's what art house cinemas are doing. And again, I looked a few weeks ago when Dune came out, and if you look at the top 100 independent classic, what would be called art house cinemas, every single one, without exception, was showing Dune and a whole host of other commercial movies. So I think, and I don't mean this in a derogatory term, because I think art house cinemas are, as smaller operators, need to be protected as much as the larger operators. We suffered massively. I mean, we were one of the most conservatively run cinema operators, and we had to go through a very painful restructuring. And we took £1 billion off our balance sheet a year ago, and because of the strikes, we had to go through a second restructuring where we took a few £100 million off our balance sheet again. Now, thanks to the support of our shareholders, we are now up and running and back in business again. But it's been a very, very painful period for all cinema operators of all sizes.
Just going back to your point about the difference between art house, independent cinemas, and yourselves as a bigger multiplex, do you accept that perhaps people go to those other cinemas, the independent ones, for want of a better phrase, a different vibe, a more perhaps, I don't know, personal experience? I don't mind where I go to cinema. Watershed, as you say, is amazing. My local cinema in Sidmouth is one screen. It's run by Scott Cinemas, and it's very intimate. That's what you get sometimes from a smaller cinema, but equally sometimes when you go and want to see a James Bond film that comes out, you want to go to a large one with a massive screen that's probably the size of several houses. But do you think there's a difference in the experience?
Well, I think, again, for us, 46% of our films we showed last year were foreign films. So, I try and fight that day in, day out. We were the first circuit, probably in Europe, where we had a license to serve wine and beer in all of our screens, because we wanted our customers to be
welcome development, yes.
No, but we have, and we are investing very heavily in our auditoria and our foyers in particular to give them that welcoming feel, and something that's evolving every year. We kind of try and reinvest to give that kind of nice welcoming feeling for our customers.
Excellent. Claire, if I can come to you, if that's okay, what impact have the strikes in the US had on the post-pandemic recovery, and when do you think that the attendance will go back to pre-COVID levels? Because we keep hearing evidence that it's not quite there. We know that several parts of life haven't returned to pre-pandemic levels yet, bus travel and also cinema going as well. So when do you think that could happen?
Well, I said about I'm an optimist too, but very definitely there is a crisis. However you look at it, we are in a very different place than we were pre-pandemic, and whether or not people do come back in the same ways and how they choose to see what they want to see. I'll just do a bit of defending for Watershed and the likes of us. Yes, we did all play Dune, but we were also playing lots of other films as well, so it wasn't just quite as simple as that. I think it's going to be very hard, not just for the likes of Picturehouse or the independents, but for the mom and pop cinemas like the cinema you talked about in Sidmouth, that for them the real difficulties are the fact that their costs have gone up so much. So the utilities have gone up over 40% over the last couple of years. it's really difficult for those mum and pop cinemas, for the Scott chains, all of those cinemas. They're the ones that are absolutely an anchor for local communities, that the costs of running those cinemas is making it almost impossible for them to survive in many cases, not in all cases. But I think the fact, the independent cinemas, a lot of them do get public funding, but for a large majority of independent cinemas in the UK, they don't have that luxury, and yet they're still as important to local communities. So I don't know the answer of when the audiences will be back. All I do know is that it's very costly for those cinemas to wait for those audiences to return.
Thank you, Claire. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Simon. Rupert.
Thanks. Thank you for our Picturehouse in Ealing. We've now got 8 screens. I think it's the biggest one. And sorry that the view went from Acton, but someone else took it over. It's now an Odeon Lux. I wanted to ask a little bit about genre. Last year, 16 of the 20 top-grossing films were prequels, sequels, live-action remakes, or existing franchises. Is that because, the public get what the public want? Or is that because there's no RT alternative?
I think the public would like more choice. We've talked a lot about the money that it costs to promote a film, to get a film out into the world. It's quite difficult for distribution. Picturehouse is also a distributor as well. So I know how expensive it can be to compete with studios selling their American films, which is essentially what those films are. They're coming from Hollywood. So it's not a level playing field. I do think that the public have actually got tired of sequels and franchises, and that is why a little bit the studio system is looking into what actually they're very risk averse, I think, studios. Understandably, if they're putting, $100 million into making a film, they have to calculate the risk for something like that. But actually, I think the public do want choice. They do want other kinds of films. They do want to be able to have a different worldview than just a Hollywood worldview.
Anyone else on that one?
Yeah, I concur with Claire around that notion of worldview, and Tim's point about a lot of the other countries in the world having very robust local film economies where the people of that country go to see films that are identifiably from that country. That's not the case in this country, I would say. The fact that last year the highest grossing British film of the year was The Great Escaper at just over £5 million. We had the second highest, just under £5 million. And then this year we've got the two of the three highest grossing British movies with Wicked Little Letters and Back to Black. So there are opportunities. Local British audiences do want to see films about identifiably British subject matter, however we should see that. I think that we have to recognise that the commercial performance of UK films is under very serious threat, and it is. I work for a company. We're headquartered in Paris, and we make British films, but it's not as if we're a British studio. The US studios are very much
don't worry, carry on.
Okay.
That's just a normal
I didn't know if it was a fire drill. The US studios are obviously, those decisions are made in Los Angeles and they're rolled out across the world with a global marketing campaign. So that's a huge point in making those films the highest grossing films in any given year. And when we take big bets on British films, we have to lay off the risk. So even when we're doing Paddington at the end of the year, which will be the biggest British film of the year by some distance, and perhaps one of the biggest films of the year, we still needed a US studio to come up with part of the financing because we don't operate on a global basis, whereas they do.
I saw Back to Black over the weekend, actually, and I've also seen the Bob Marley. It's like another boring genre of just people with no imagination. It's just real-life things that happened in our lifetime not that long ago.
I mean, whatever, our own individual taste and such, and we may like individual movies or not, I think it's gratifying to think that we can make a film that's, apart from one day, entirely shot in London, and is about an identifiable British artist. Whereas, and in the same way, I'd say, and the financing model on that is very, very different from the financing model on the Bob Marley film, which was a Paramount film on a global historic superstar of music.
Yeah, Tim, are people just being served up the same thing again and again?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, last year is really difficult to look at it as a normal year because it was still significantly down on pre-pandemic. But I think what the last 2 years have shown is that every demographic group for every genre of film have returned to the cinema. And when you have a range of business, I mean, even going back into 22. You look at how Belfast did, a black and white film about an 11-year-old boy growing up with the Troubles. You can imagine that Hollywood pitch. And the fact that it did
It have a famous name behind it.
It did, but it's still, a famous name only gets you, that opens the door, it doesn't get you through it. But but it was an extraordinary film that did £16 million in the UK, which was one of the highest grossing black and white films in about 50 years. And it shows that demand is absolutely there. That demand for high quality content, for high quality British and independent film is there. We use AI to book our screens exclusively. And our AI has been an incredible tool because we know what our customers want to see right across the entire country. And we know, as an example, there's a small Asian community in Inverness, so we will bring them Asian films. We have that level of granularity in our business, and that's why one of the reasons why we show so many movies to so many of our customers.
So if we're talking why would an independent film make it? Budget, casting, story, is it all of the above, are you saying in your answers? What's the X factor thing that an independent film needs to break through?
To break through, you are somebody who's prepared to spend a lot of money marketing it.
Yeah, I was going to say, at the end of the day, marketing is key. The money that's spent to get a film out there to the audience. Now, it might be, we released a British film last year called Scrapper, by a young first-time female director, and we're lucky we have cinemas as well, as so we always have a base where we can sort of push to our audiences. But at the end of the day, it was how much money we spent on that film in order to get it visible to an audience. That's how you break through.
and within that, Scrapper, Rye Lane, How to Have Sex, all universally admired movies within their own context, all seen by not a lot of people at the cinema.
Absolutely.
So that it's very important to remember that these are films perceived to be burgeoning new talent, or the next wave of filmmakers that might make great films. Not many people went, and the reason not many people went is because the economics for Clare and for others and for any of us is that you can't commit the same kinds of marketing spend that you can if you're backed by a Hollywood studio that, remember, is giving you that global hit.
And also, to be brutally frank, a lot of it now is not about the theatrical. The theatrical is the window for it going on streaming platforms, and a lot of the streaming platforms are very cautious about the films that they take on to invest. So when you're releasing an independent film, you need all the stages of the digital at the end of the theatrical, and if you don't have that, it makes it really not economical to release the film.
But theatrical still creates the value, right?
Yeah, the theatrical creates the value.
That's one thing that hasn't changed in 100 years. We are the engine that drives all the ancillary revenue streams, and that is something that over the pandemic period, the Hollywood studios and other filmmakers realized how important we are to launch their movies and how we are the best way to monetize their movies. And that is why you've seen a complete 180-degree turnaround with the studios in particular and other filmmakers that during the pandemic period, they released their films directly to streaming services. And without exception, every single studio has now come out publicly and said that was a mistake, and they have now supported the screen sector worldwide.
I think that last one's kind of been answered.
Yeah, I think that's right. Thank you, Rupa. Can I just ask you about this, Claire? So, where there's when there's a film like Scrapper, which I thought was a great movie, back in the day, I mean, so I'm thinking back to when the Full Monty came out. You know, it was like pretty much a low-budget British independent movie, right? And initially, I went to see it. The first time I went to see it, cinema was quite empty, and it was word of mouth. It was a sort of, it took time. It was a sort of galvanising process.
It was released by a studio, though.
Yes, but I'm using that as an example of how it took time for that movie to kind of pick up a groundswell of support. And I went back to see it some weeks later, and you couldn't get a ticket. It was like absolutely heaving because, you know, everyone had gone around and telling all their friends how brilliant it was, and everyone was going to see it. I get the sense that you no longer have the time for that to happen sort of organically anymore. You have to get either a quick support for a film or pull it. Am I wrong?
I think the model now much more is that people pull films off very quickly. I think back in the day, films were allowed to breathe more than they are now. It's always on to the next one, the next one, the next one. And I think that's very much an American model. It's come driven by the way that it worked in the States. That said, Picturehouse as a company tends to be a company that keeps films going on. I mean, for example, Anatomy of a Fall, which we released, we're still playing it in one or two venues 25 weeks after it opened. So we are a believer in audiences do, for certain films, not so much for the blockbusters, but for the more independent kind of films, they take a while. They don't all rush out the opening weekend. So it does take a little time for those films to breathe. But again, I think and this is not just about Picturehouse, I think it's more for the independent films, the mom and pop cinemas throughout the UK. I think it's very difficult for them to be able to let films breathe simply because of the economics of running the cinema, that they have to get the new film in.
Alex, Wicked Little Letters is an interesting example of this. Another great film, which you're going to think I'm obsessed, but I've also seen that. Also, that was brilliant. That actually is still going in some cinemas after about 8 weeks after it was first released. Why? And what can we learn from the experience of Wicked Little Letters that could be shared with other?
I think, first and foremost, it's a film that pleases an audience. It actually, I would say, the reviews for the film were not spectacular. They were okay, but really, it's a film that pleases an audience. It's a very enjoyable experience. It also did serve a traditionally underserved audience, and it's got good performers. But I hasten to add, the film wasn't cheap. It was just over the £15 million mark that we talk about as a low-budget independent film, and it was ultimately only made because of an exceptional set of circumstances, which included, the enthusiasm of us, but also upfront support from Canal Plus for us to make it, even though we thought the margins on the film wouldn't be as high as they should be on a standard investment. So I guess the point is, we're sort of always the hits are always booking the trend rather than following the trend. And that's one of the challenges. And even something like the Full Monty all those years ago did actually open at number one. It was just one of those spectacular word-of-mouth stories that just carried on and carried on. So they did, with something like the Full Monty, they did have to spend quite a lot of money to get it started. And that's again my point about actually quite often making that commitment to spending that money on releasing the film is actually, as Alex Ferguson would say, squeaky bum time, because you're just not sure what's going to happen. You think, but you can never be sure until you've got those first day grosses.
I think one thing on Wicked Little Letters, though, you're right in that it's an underserved audience, and that audience, which is 35 plus, it really tapped into what that audience don't get enough of, quite frankly, because they don't want to see Marvel heroes. They want something that they can identify with, and that film gave it to them.
Yes, I can definitely identify with that. I could watch Olivia Colman swearing all day long. Yeah. John.
Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. I was interested, Mr. Richards, when you said that cinemas drive footfall into local areas. Does it depend on the area you suggested with your Inverness story, or does it depend on the type of film that you're showing, how much footfall there is?
No, I mean, I think it's a wide selection of films, and that is what we do. And I'll just add, only because I was such a huge fan of Wicked Little Letters myself, and we're still playing it, by the way. We're still playing it in quite a few of our screens, and I agree with Clare as well about the importance of the tale. But I think the cinemas themselves, small and large, all play a major role in communities. And I frequently get letters from very small communities saying there's an opportunity here, and we look at it very carefully. And because there are audiences who love movies everywhere, and there's no shortage of examples of, certainly from a mental health standpoint, the impact that it's had on mental health and getting people through kind of the very difficult times that people had during the pandemic. And for a local community. I mean, everyone here can probably remember the first movie they saw on their first date or whatever it might be. And, we are a very, very big part of every community. And that has not changed, and it's growing as we speak.
I remember interviewing Terence Conran about the importance of the visual for food. And he said it was something quite distinctive in the UK, that in France, for example, people would go to a restaurant just for the quality of the food alone. But in the UK, there's got to be visual stimulation. You've got to produce an elegant or trendy looking restaurant. How much has that played into your calculations as well? I go to your cinema in Aldgate, and it's very cool, groovy, mid-century modern furniture, which I happen to like, which I think was what drew me in initially. I think I was walking past and I thought, oh, that looks quite nice. It was a coffee shop, and I booked up subsequently. Am I unusual, or is that quite common, that it's look that drives people's footfall?
Well, movies are the ultimate driver, and I think we try and cater to our customers for what they might like. And I think there's certainly no shortage of demand for popcorn in the UK. And I think our customers love popcorn, and they love sweets as well. Every market is different. Our Italian customers love to have a little pizzeria before or after their film. And
you learn all this through AI?
No, that we just learned from experience. AI is really for the movies themselves. And the AI really determines what movie we show, in what cinema, in what screen, and at what time. So it's been an extraordinary tool. And it's allowed us to play considerably more movies and play those movies longer, because there may be an instance, as today, with Wicked Little Letters, where we know there's an audience who might not want to go on opening weekend, but they still want to see it on a big screen. So we will cater to them. When was it released?
February the 23rd.
Yes, I wouldn't go to an opening weekend because I don't like the crowds. I like it to be a bit calmer and quieter. I was interested, all three of you were nodding along to the importance of marketing, though I think you mentioned that the Full Monty was word of mouth. How important are reviews for films? Because again, all these things are personal, but I read film reviews, and it wouldn't always determine whether I go and see a film, and I would read a range of different reviews, but there's a couple of reviewers I would pay attention to, I think.
There are certain, there's times I think it's almost counter review, depending on who you're reading. But
French was the one that I always read.
No, but I think reviews do play a role, and I find it very frustrating at times that, particularly with smaller films and independent films, where they get very negative reviews, I think unfairly. So reviews do play a role, and there's times I want to kind of have, in fact I have actually called or written where I felt very strongly on smaller films where I just really disagreed with their thoughts on it. And it does have an impact, because whether it's one customer or two customers or more, it's hard to say, but it does have an impact.
It goes back to that notion everyone's a critic, right? But very interesting. You mentioned Philip French. Philip French was known as a proper film critic who knew his stuff, and actually you would take his opinion very seriously.
And he could reference half a century of films
film
and
knowledge,
he would refer to black and white films that he'd seen when he was first working as a film reviewer.
And there remain a few, proper film critics. There are some very good and serious-minded film critics who actually engage with the material. I think one of the things that has happened, though, and I think probably speaks to the notion of perhaps the centrality of reviews isn't quite what it was, because a lot of publications now even don't have film critics. So we fell foul just recently of an Evening Standard review who's not a film critic, but gave a page one review of a film. And obviously at that time we're going, well, this is not a great review for one of our movies, that's not great. But it is interesting that whole ecology has shifted, and a lot of publications simply don't have what I'd characterise as proper film critics.
And they don't review
many films.
So you would find that they would probably, if it was a smaller foreign language film, they might not review it.
Yeah, I find out. So when I Google to see what the reviews are, far too often for me, it's just the most obvious ones and a kind of sameness amongst the reviews. It's almost as if they're reading one another's reviews for validation of what they're going to say. But Ms. Bint, you mentioned the international model and people wanting a different world view. That's interesting. Is that really so? Isn't it the case that the Americanization of movies is really almost universal now, isn't it?
Not at all. I think that actually...
He said provocatively.
Yeah, customers more and more want to be able to... Mark and Catharine talked about it, but, we're doing huge amounts of rep now, huge amounts of seasons and festivals. There's a real appetite, particularly with younger people, who want to see films on the big screen that they've never seen before. They want to see films from all over the world, because stories are not just about the UK and the US. It's a real global desire to understand a story, whether it comes from Japan or wherever, that they can be excited
and the
by
universal
that.
Human experience.
Exactly.
I'm watching something at the moment that is absolutely gripping, and it's making me rush home to catch up with the next one. And it's one of yours. I'm amazed I haven't seen it before. It's Spotless, which has just popped up on Netflix.
Oh right, on the TV side. Sorry. Yeah.
But it's a Studiocanal. It's on Netflix, and it's what's interesting about it is it's a French. I understand it's a French production with French actors speaking English, set in London, and it's got a bit of a Killing Eve vibe about it as well, and it's clever, and I can't believe I'm told there's only one series. I'm heartbroken.
Well, one series is because actually the perceived wisdom in terms of foreign language television shows within the UK broadcasting infrastructure, within which I include...
This is in English?
It's in English, but it's perceived to be rather challenging. And actually, I can't speak with as much knowledge around TV commissioning. I have some knowledge of it, but it's a very different process. It's almost a business-to-business environment, television commissioning.
Well, those series like that are cinematic, aren't they?
Yeah, they
really,
are.
Because they read as cinema, even though it's a series.
But its delivery is on.
But before we finish, and before I hand back to the chair, I just want to ask all of you, as I asked the first panel, about the idea of a levy, because I don't know if you heard us say, but we've been to France and trying to take evidence from what we can learn. Both your predecessors, who were here in the previous panel, both said they thought that, well, one enthusiastically said the levy would work, and the other said that he was very open to the idea of the levy. Could I just ask quickly, the three of you, do you think this is a runner? Would it help?
I think we are going through a very fragile recovery as an industry, and that's all screens of all sizes. And I think adding an additional burden would be very, very difficult. And looking at experiences outside of the UK, what's really has helped is a VAT break. And if you look at the kind of numbers that have happened in our other markets, I mean, Germany now is 7% against 19% normally, Italy 10% versus 22%, Poland 8 against 23 normally, and so forth. A small break like that for the industry will go a long way for the screen sector. And I think also following the Italian model and a few other markets in terms of help with actual tax concessions or breaks with refurbishments or new screens would also help. And I think a disproportionate amount of that help would go to smaller operators, to Clare's point. And we know the numbers right now, 50% of smaller operators are suffering. 50% of small operators are most likely operating at a loss today. And they do need help. And some of those small steps can go a long way.
I think on the levy, it's always been a source of much debate, obviously right back to the ED levy, which appeared to coincide with a very robust time of British cinema. But it also ended up essentially losing its purpose because effectively cinema operators were trying to hit quotas, which probably isn't the thing to burden them with. I think, again, you mentioned that you've been to France. Obviously, with France, it's more of it has been historically more of a coherent system right the way through the value chain, from the production side to the distribution side to the exhibition side. And if I was to say one main take-home, in a sense, it's actually seeing that overall value chain as a coherent whole, and any policy recommendations considering all of those parts of the chain.
I agree with Tim. I think we're in a very fragile state at the moment. The VAT reduction would help not just the independents, it would help us all in what is a very difficult time. And if you think that cinemas are the anchor in so many communities, I feel really passionately about this, not just Picturehouse, but communities all through the UK, that kind of help would secure those venues, which then bring in the restaurants, the shops, the communities that come out to those cinemas. That, for me, would be the most significant help. On the distribution side, I think help with being able to release films with some tax credit for films under £15 million would be a big help.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John. Julie.
Thank you, Chair. And I have to say, my view of film critics is I usually think the opposite. So if a film gets a good review, I usually think, well, I won't like that. Not always, but usually. I might have a quirky taste. Tim, local films perform well in European markets. Why do you think local British films don't perform as well in the UK market?
I think they do.
You think they do?
I just don't think there's enough British films out there, and I think you kind of see a disproportionate number because, and again, you have to look at kind of pre-pandemic and post-pandemic and recovery because success breeds success, and what we've seen in all of our markets in continental Europe is we've seen a couple of local films do very, very well, and There Is Always Tomorrow, Giancarlo Domani, is a case in point. You know, that film is a calling card to financiers that this is a vibrant business worth investing in. And right now we're lacking that, and I think we just need a little bit more stimulus here in the country to get film production going. And I think, again, credit to government, the 40% tax rebate right now is huge. It's not to be underestimated. And I think we need to give that a little bit of breathing space because I think that's going to actually do very well here in the next couple of years.
You agree with that, Claire?
I think the fact that British film will be supported by the tax reduction, but then you have to have that, like in France, it has to be the whole ecosystem. So it's great that there'll be more films being made, but they need to be distributed and they need to be shown. So you need to make sure that you've got every bit of that working, rather than just having lots and lots of films being made with nowhere to go.
Yeah. Moving on to France, Alex, how does the UK market differ from Studiocanal's experience in France?
I mean, vastly, largely because of what Claire just talked about. It is an entire ecosystem geared to the promotion of French cinema. Studiocanal France, for instance, and I've only been at Studiocanal for 4 years, but it astonished me that they have a working model and a very robust business model from releasing mainstream French films of all kinds in a variety of genre, and that underwrites what they do. I think it's fair to say that's impossible for a UK company to do. To Tim's point, I think films can do well, but it's a can. And the evidence of the last few years, and that this is not just pandemic, this is exacerbated by the pandemic, but it was happening prior to then, is that British films haven't performed well from the perspective of people in the UK going to see them in cinemas compared to other markets. And I think
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think curiously it's the paradox of the language. There's obviously local people, you're getting films in the French language, you're getting films in the German language, you're getting films in the Dutch language. So sometimes the English language actually works against us because we're competing very directly and more clearly with American films. Partly it's to do with perhaps a less 360 film culture that there is here compared to France, and I think that takes a generation to change. That's possibly not something around policy. That goes right back to notions of training, education, the school curriculum, everything. But I think practically in the shorter term, one of the ways to ameliorate that would be to think of the ecosystem at large, because I think we do run the risk of there being suddenly a supply of British movies. It doesn't necessarily mean that demand will follow in quite the way that we would want it to, unless we create circumstances whereby we can encourage that demand.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Clyde.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome. Can I just turn to tax? And so what would a 25% tax relief on print and advertising costs in lower budget films have on the distribution for UK films?
A lot.
Right. I suspected you might say that, but fill your boots.
But as I said, it is this ecosystem. That would be a fantastic bonus to us when we release smaller films, because it's very costly, and the risk for us with smaller films is profound. But then it is about having the cinemas and the cinema support to show them. So it really it would make a big difference. I'm sure it would to you.
Bluntly, we'll make more British films and spend more money on them. Bluntly, that's what we would do. There have been, over the last 4 years, been countless occasions of us either greenlighting a film or not greenlighting a British film. And obviously, when you make the investment, and we're a producer-distributor, when you make the investment, you're considering not only how much it's going to cost you to make the film, but how much you're going to have to spend to generate the revenues that you want to. So, and I think I am obviously cribbing from the BFI's Research and Statistics Unit and their estimate that it would cost effectively around not just over £9 million a year, when we've been looking at a sum around production, which is obviously dwarfs that. So it does strike me as a relatively less expensive way of generating British audiences seeing British movies.
And the government is now supporting the production of independent films through the tax relief and the tax credit. So, will this? What will happen as a consequence of that if we are producing more films, but we've not solved the issue of demand to get bums on seats to watch those films?
Well, they'll disappear.
They won't work.
They won't.
And you'll be in a counter narrative of, why have we invested all that movie in British cinema when actually people aren't going to see the movies? I mean, it's just really, really important, as I say, just to go back to that notion that when anyone invests in a British film, they are not simply assessing how much it's going to cost to make, it's almost also how much it's going to cost to market. So those two key factors make the investment or not.
So I suppose the follow-up question is, what can you do then as the people who need to attract those audiences, generate that demand? What can you do in response to what the government
spend money, which we do. You know, we've had two very successful British films in the past few weeks. We spent a lot of money marketing them. We've been very well supported by our exhibitor partners. It can work, but it's actually, when you consider that those two movies and One Life, which was referenced earlier, have grossed more than any of the other British films bar Belfast since the pandemic, that I don't think reflects a flourishing film culture when you only had really 4 or 5 British films gross more than £5 million over a 3-4 year period. That's unique, actually, in terms of underperformance compared to any other territory.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Clive. Tim, can I just take you back to AI? You've spoken about how you use the AI tool to programme your screens. So if AI is trained on what went before, and demand for British independent films has fallen over recent years, as we're just hearing from Alex, how can you be confident that AI isn't sort of somehow underestimating the potential of demand and then, as a consequence, failing to offer your audiences new content?
Well, I think hopefully the numbers speak for themselves. 46% of the movies that we showed last year were foreign language films. And the AI is an absolutely incredible tool. It took us 8 years, 53 models in beta to perfect it. We were the first in the world to do anything like it. And it's a classic AI model where it is better today than it was yesterday. It's constantly learning and constantly improving. And that is why we're able to show Alex's film Wicked Little Letters today, because the AI knows there's an audience for that, and not only do they know there's an audience for it, but they know where that audience actually is across the country. So it's allowed us to play more British films, more independent films, and more foreign language films than almost any other player right now.
Thank you very much. And can I just also ask you about skills and training and workforce retention? Next month we've got a session on that specifically, but based on your time as the chair of the BFI, what do you think we should be asking our witnesses on that occasion to get to the bottom of why there is such a skills crisis in the industry, despite the fact that there are so many initiatives across the sector and so many people who are desperately keen to get into it?
If you look at the successes that we are having today as a nation, if you look at the disproportionate number of awards that we win today, it is because of the investment that was made in the sector 20 years ago. And I think now is not the time to take our foot off the gas when we need it more than ever. And I think that you can certainly see the impact that has had. And education from a personal standpoint, I mean, I was chair of skill set, film skills, and that's been a very big part of what I wanted to do, and even that was one of my high priorities at my 11 years at the BFI, because that's identifying future filmmakers, and I think it is a big part of this. I think it's a number of factors, but I think one of them is I think there's too many people doing too many things, and I think we need to kind of bring it down a little bit, consolidate a little bit more. I'm very jealous of public money, and I think that we can do things a little bit more efficiently right now on the educational side. And part of it is getting the word out to small communities, small lower economic groups, that there are opportunities here in this industry, and you don't have to be a lead actor or director. There are skills needed for hairdressers, for set designers, for carpenters, for writers. We need all those skills, and that's why I love the London Screen Academy, because that is teaching core skills for filmmaking, and it's also bringing in kind of a lower socioeconomic group to jobs that are well needed, and that's everywhere across the country.
And with that reflection of your time at the BFI, we actually have the BFI appearing in front of us in a few weeks' time as well. What else should we be asking them?
I think the BFI has done an extraordinary job in the last few years, and not just under my tenureship, but under previous tenureships as well. And I think the only thing that I would say for the BFI going forward is not to be afraid of commercial British films, and not to be afraid to identify and support and nurture commercial British films. And that might be part of the issue, the bigger issue, that there's been maybe too much commitment to the cultural side as opposed at the cost of the commercial side. And that would be probably my only small issue that's evolving. But even with then, it's trying to find tomorrow's Chris Nolan, and I think that's where the BFI really excels at.
Very good, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our session today. Can I just ask the same question I asked our previous panel? Is there anything that you wish that we'd asked you? Is there anything else you wanted to get off your chest before we conclude today's session, Alex, Claire?
I don't think so.
No, I mean, just reinforcing again that I think that we need to create an ecosystem. Yeah. That is the most crucial bit of having a thriving, healthy, sustainable industry that covers all kinds of cinemas, that just to reinforce that point.
Yeah, I just want to thank the committee, because I think it is the right time to be having these discussions. We are at a pivotal point in our industry, and I think we can really turn the tides and make a difference.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Very good to see you all today. Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.